Welcome back to Faith, Frauds, and Falsehoods, where we explore various cults and religions of the world. Hey, tonight we're starting our discussion. Actually, we're continuing our discussion on NXIVM. Now, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to help others find us.
Man, Matt, you are always so excited to do that part.
I'm excited to be here, Brian.
Right? So before we get started, right, let's remind everybody we're sharing our opinions, right? It's not our employers or our church's opinions, it's ours. So let's get started, Matt. Shall we?
Yeah. Don't blame them for the mess we say.
That's right. So what are we talking about tonight, Matt?
We're going to talk about the
craziness
of NXIVM.
The teachings of NXIVM.
Before we start on what the teachings actually are, let's start a little bit. Me and you've talked a little bit about this has been a little more complicated than some of the other groups we've covered.
For sure.
And why is this more complicated? What's been more challenging for us here?
For me in particular, right, they never really claimed to be a religion, right? They were a business, and they were in the business of self-help, right? They weren't a religion, so they didn't have a theology. They don't have, a Christology, right? Because they weren't a religion, let alone Christian at that point. So it's hard to break down what's a teaching versus what's just a social issue with them. Some of the things we're going to talk about tonight, you and I debated on, does it belong in this episode or in the social issues episode?
Oh, for sure. And I think that's good, though, because, we always talk about one of the things that we think we bring to the cult podcast, video, YouTube world is to approach it from a Christian perspective,
Yeah.
But I think that can sometimes not be as helpful because when we look at a group like this, there's really not a Christian perspective to look at this because we're not judging them based on scripture and things like that, right?
Right. We are, but not in the same way that we would for...
But we don't have those same arguments because we don't have that commonality there to discuss. And so I think that makes it harder for us to look at. However, what I think is important for us to share with our viewers is that doesn't make this any less harmful. You don't need the 10 commandments and make somebody act like they're Jesus to start a cult. Right. And, Raniere here did assume a Christ-like, I don't want to say Christ-like. That's as of Christ. He
had a messianic complex for
sure. There you go. That's the word I was looking for. He had a messianic complex. I was listening to an interview. Somebody, the Mark Ricente was talking about how, obviously this guy's a narcissist, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he always played the role of not being a narcissist. Well, I could be wrong about things. Well, I don't know everything.
Right.
While at the same time, always knowing everything. And he mentioned that Raniere had this thing, and this is, again, a social issue, but it plays to how the teachings worked out. So that's why I bring it up here. It's that complication we're talking about. He had this thing where he would often not prop himself up. He would never tell you he's the smartest man in the world.
Right.
That he's been in the Guinness Book of World Records. He would never tell you that he was a concert level pianist at 8 or 9 years old.
Yeah.
Right. He would never tell you that he's one of the top 3 critical thinkers in the world. He would never tell you any of these things. However, he would insist that others tell you these things about him.
Right.
And he justified that saying, he needed other people to talk him up so that they could to be helped by his ideas.
Yep.
And he tried to patent some of these ideas, but they were so not original, he couldn't get patents for them.
Right. And, you can't really patent teaching, right? Because teaching is just a thing, right? So there was that. But that whole idea of he wasn't really a lot of these things is part of what led to his collapse, right? Some of the people started to see, I've never actually seen him play the piano, and yet we hear all the time about how he's this great concert pianist.
Yeah, and wasn't he like judo or jujitsu or something?
Jujitsu master.
Champion?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yep. All these things, and the people never saw it expressed, right? They heard it said, but they never experienced it.
So where do we start if we're going to talk about his teachings?
So really, we've got to start at the beginning, right? Because why wouldn't we? We need to start with what influenced them. And he had some influences from the human potential movement and humanism. So humanism, for those that may or may not know, is this idea that humanity is the end-all be-all, right? There's no supernatural transcendence. There's nothing. Humans are the ultimate creation, right? For lack of a better term, because they don't have this idea of creation.
And he was the ultimate human.
And he himself was the ultimate human, right? And the human potential movement kind of takes that humanistic idea and says, humans, since we are supposed to be at the very top, we must be capable of so much more. And they're pushing for human growth, right? They wrote a lot on their website about ethics and morals and making the world a better place through this idea of human growth.
And that was the thing. That's what he was selling was. They termed it in the executive, these executive programs and things. But it was selling making you better. How to make you better yourself, how to get over things. And I will say that of all the interviews I've watched and stuff, I haven't seen anybody say, "Oh, he was full of it and they didn't help me get better." Right. I have heard that they helped me get better at things, and then after I got out of this cult, all those old things came back again.
Yeah.
I kind of just put myself into denial. So he used a lot of the same stuff that Scientology used.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the
and
same
we heard the
ideas.
same thing from a lot of Scientologists about how some of the teachings or the tech actually helped them with some things.
Right. Yep.
Helped them be more assertive, helped them to process, old memories and bad things, traumas that had happened in their past and things like that.
Right. Yeah, he had this, if you remember back from Scientology, Hubbard had the Ingrams, right? This mass of matter, energy, space, and time that would attach to you. And it was generally negative emotions and things from the past. And Raniere had fixations, right? They were the same kind of concept that something from your past, you fixated on it. And it just kind of stuck to you. They also have the same idea of suppressive people.
Yes.
In NXIVM.
They call them suppressives.
And
look, let's talk about that for just a moment. I don't want to get us way over our time here, but let's talk about suppressive people and the concept. Mm-hmm. It's not, all our enemies are suppressive people. That's where they get to, but that's not where they start. They start about in life, there are some people who are just not going to get it and are going to be suppressive.
Yep.
I think that if you think through that rationally, you can think, maybe not rationally, if you think through that using your personal experience, I bet some names just came to your mind when I said there are some people in life who are just going to be suppressive. They're going to oppose you, right?
Yep.
And I want to name those names, but I'm not going to. I can think of political old bitty ladies in Texarkana.
Yeah.
I can think of firefighters' moms. I'm hoping they watch. They know who I'm talking about. I can think of former mayors who want to fight people in the alley. I'm probably going a little far. These are just suppressive people who are just going to be like that kind of, right? Now, in Christianity, we teach that nobody is without redemption.
Correct.
Or nobody is unworthy of redemption.
Right.
But they don't necessarily, or they're not necessarily going for that. They're just saying some people are suppressive people, and that's how that's going to be. Scientology's like that, and I think he probably got these ideas from Scientology. Some of these teachings.
You and I had talked about that, and a lot of this was coming up in the 90s, and Scientology was kind of starting to be more in the mainstream. So that's
but those
possible.
Ideas in Scientology had been introduced in the 50s and 60s.
Right, but they were also very, very, very secretive in the 50s, 60s, and 70s.
But not about those ideas.
You don't think so?
The book was still out. Dianetics was still out.
True.
And some of the other stuff was still out.
Yeah,
and this is where he kind of started with the original Dianetics.
Yep.
Right? Of let's find those things, those memories, those trauma things in your life, and let's work them out.
Yep.
Now, they went a little different way about doing it. Of course, they're not using any machines, but Scientology didn't start with machines either.
Yep.
They started just talking it through. And way they deal with it here is to keep talking about it until you worked out the thing that's no longer a trauma to you.
Yep. Through the
kind of the same thing.
Yeah, through the process of EM, right? So exploration of meaning.
What do you make that mean?
What do you make it mean? Yep. And it's Edmondson. What's her first name? Susan? Sarah Edmondson. You know, one of the things that she talked about in her book was where you place your values, right? The highest thing that you value. So they would take this idea, right? If you wanted to do something, and they would ask, what do you make that mean? Right? What they were really asking was, is that your highest value? Right? Does that overarching idea, is it greater than everything else in your life at this moment? And it's just, it gets so deep into emotional suppression. I know I'm jumping down on my notes a little bit, but the segue was perfect for it. So
I know emotional suppression is super important because that's exactly what he's talking about. We have people who said they helped me, they changed my life, and then when they got out of this, all those things came back because it was really just suppression.
It was
they didn't actually work through their stuff.
Right.
They just over and over were suppressing it. Look, it's the old thing. Boy, you better stop crying. I'm going to give you something to cry about.
Right.
Which is very bad parenting, by the way. But what that'll do is cause you to suppress the crying.
Right.
But it ain't going to change what happened.
It doesn't change what happened. Right. And it doesn't change how you learn to process it.
Yeah.
Right.
Don't mean you don't want to cry. It just means you're not going to cry.
Yep. All this does is it reduces emotional responses later on. Because for them, in their mind, emotions cloud judgment, and you can't make good decisions if you're not using reason and rational thought.
Well, and that's what's said is reason and rational thought. But when they control their emotions, that means someone's actually controlling you. And I'm going to skip back up a little bit from where you were at. Let's talk about V Week and Celebration of Vanguard.
Okay.
Because this is one of those controlling of emotions. Are you trying to go somewhere else?
No, I was thinking that one might fall into next week. But like we said in the beginning, these two episodes are going to be so meshed together.
This was part of how they did it. So they advertised this about, this emotional suppression because emotions make you not rational and things like that. But they also, in the third day of training, in your first 5 days, in the third day of training, they teach you that you must have, what's the term? It's kind of like reverence. You must submit to something.
Yeah,
to somebody.
You pay tribute.
You must pay tribute to what you're learning from. And they teach that on the third day of training to pay tribute to Vanguard, which is Raniere, and to Prefect, which is Salzman.
So V Week is a week-long celebration for Raniere's birthday.
They charge them to come.
They charged them to come.
And they have it worked out. Just like Scientology, they learned how to make this work. So while they charge the people who can afford to come, and they really encourage everybody to do it, for those who can't afford it, what they can do is they can work their way there.
Right.
Sarah Edmondson talked about this in her book. They found a way that, while she wasn't yet a big star who could afford a lot of money, so they found a way her and her boyfriend could come and work during V Week to be there. And while there, she learned how it was never okay to criticize Raniere.
Right.
Because they turned it around that if she was criticizing him and he had all these great ideas, there was really something that was wrong with her. And again, that's part of that brainwashing thing.
Comes back to using those emotions to control and manipulate people.
Right. So if your religion is doing that, you might be in a cult. This wasn't a religion to them, but it was. They just didn't call it that. I would go
so far, Matt, and not say might. I would say if your religion is doing that, you're in a cult. Flat out.
You know? And when some of our viewers start thinking about that, they might start thinking,
I'm much more willing to say that your religion is wrong. Than Matt is.
That's okay. I'll say your religion's wrong, so we'll be all right.
There we go.
So this V week in the celebration, so it was a week-long celebration for his birthday, right? They would get together, they would do choreography, they'd film things, they'd do jokes, they would just get together to entertain him. They'd cook, they'd have big parties, just a big thing to show their loyalty to him. And he encouraged this because they needed to pay tribute for all these things. He'd helped them with things in their life, so they're supposed to pay tribute. Some of them took it more serious than others, but by the end of the week, they all took it very serious because they were chastised if they didn't take it seriously.
Right.
And they were threatened to be thrown out after they've already paid. So I think that goes right in with the emotional suppression.
Yeah, for sure.
Because then you start turning the power of your emotions over to someone else.
Yep. What happens, right, is that produces internal isolation, right? Your reduction in emotions leads to a lack of response, and personal identity, right, is completely forced away, right? Because emotions are a part of our personal identity. It's part of who we are. And if you're pushing those aside, you're being made to conform with everyone else, and yet you're completely isolated in that.
Well,
it's an emotional. It's just a terrible, terrible thing to do to somebody.
They were taught not to question Raniere, not to publicly question him or even privately question him. Not because, he could never be wrong. He himself said he could be wrong.
Yeah.
But they were taught not to question because it was better for the group. Because if you question him publicly, I'd heard Mark Vicente talk about Raniere had said something along the lines of, people need to always see me as a 10. I need people to talk me up like I'm a 10 because I'm really a negative 10. And I need people, in order to balance out as even just being a 0, I need people to talk me up to a 10.
Yep.
That's why he always wanted other people to say the positive things about him and talk him up. He didn't do that himself. That was getting everybody thinking, well, he is the greatest man. He is the greatest man. And he used this over and over with the women in the group. By the way, the group was mostly women. There were men involved.
Right.
But it was a lot of women, and a lot of women who looked and looked a very particular way. Young, thin, dark-haired, usually women.
Yeah.
He had a particular type, and those are the people he liked to recruit. He also recruited people because of their status. Mark Vicente mentioned that he was recruited because of his status. He had done a documentary, and that's when he got recruited. The Bronfman sisters, who were also probably his lovers, at least one of them was, they were recruited because of their money.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
They had lots of money. And that's the other thing. None of this stuff was cheap.
Yeah, no.
He paid for all these teachings. He didn't just offer this. If you got anything free from him, it's when he offered to go for a walk. But you paid for these teachings, and you paid for these in classes to learn these things.
Yeah, and the 5-day class was what, like $2,500 or something?
Just to get started. And it just got more expensive from there.
Yep. So let's jump down to those classes, right? So the Executive Success Program. So that was kind of their set of classes and their process for teaching Raniere's ideas, right? Salzman kind of developed them out so that they would have the most impact on people and get them to come back and pay for the next one. And they were designed to be putting this emotional suppression into place, but also to be helping you think that you were working through some of your problems.
Right, because they'd have you work through your problems, and then have you go through, okay, you got to hang up with this and a fear of that, and that could help people in their career and stuff.
Yeah.
And I think it probably did help some people in their careers, at least for a while. But they did that with the intention of taking as much from them as possible.
Right. Yep.
That was like their base thing, their executive success program with the classes. Then they had other groups based on this. Hey, look, you learned a lot from this. and we have continuing classes with this. But look, we have these other groups, and they had the men's group and the women's group where they had some other teachings. And of course, all that costs money.
Yep. Yeah. The men's group was SOP, the Society of Protectors.
Yes.
And Jeunesse was the women's group.
Women's group. Yes. And one, featured thing there was he taught that women were flawed, that they relied on their emotions and da-da-da. And he basically taught them they were flawed, and the only way they could be more empowered was to learn to get past these things.
Mm-hmm.
So it seemed like he's teaching them to be more empowered, but what he started off was a baseline that they were wrong.
Right. Yeah. He started tearing them down so that he could build them into what he wanted them to be.
I've heard a preacher talk about that before. You got to get them lost before you can get them saved.
Mm-hmm. But at the same time, right, this Jeunesse and SOP, they weren't just, tearing down the women to build them back up. It was driving a wedge between men and women.
Yes. And
pushing them further and further apart from each other.
Well, and that was necessary because Keith Raniere has a sex addiction.
Mm-hmm.
And he was his whole life, he'd been very charming. He could, easily seduce many women and things like that. This was a pretty common thing with him. But he got more and more of the sex addiction and got more and more into more, I don't know how to say this in any sort of family friendly way, some more extreme stuff.
Right.
Really horrible things. And in order to do that, he needed more followers, basically more women who would just completely, not just go on a date with him, but completely follow him. He told all these women that he was celibate, and yet he was sleeping with almost every one of them.
Right.
Not all of them, but the vast majority.
Yeah, he told them that he was a...
Recap? There's an R word.
It's an R word, and I had it.
Basically a monk.
Right. It basically means that he was a monk. Yes.
But yet he wasn't at all.
Right. No, not at all.
Many of them knew this to not be the case, but they believed he was holy. That reminded me of Charles Manson. He told the women that there was something wrong with them, but he had the answers.
Yeah.
And that by sleeping with him, they could be better. That's exactly the message Charles Manson preached.
Mm-hmm.
And, maybe he learned some of this from him too.
It's possible that this was a time when things were interesting, to say the least.
So, again, I'm trying to keep us under our 30 minutes, and we're coming up on 23. So he had the men's group and the women's group. Like you said, he kind of encouraged division between them. He kind of moved the men and women against and away from each other. The Sarah Edmondson had mentioned she married one of the men in the group.
Yep.
And her husband was one of the leaders in the men's group. But I think he was not really encouraging that sort of behavior.
Right.
She even mentioned about how a lot of couples would come in the group, and even if they came in together, they would get split apart inside. And he wouldn't just directly order it like some of our other cult leaders.
Mm-hmm.
But more and more, they would have other things they were working on and stuff they'd have to keep away from each other. Keep secrets from each other. I tell you, if you're keeping secrets all the time, you sure can't build a good relationship.
That's right.
Something's eventually going to crack,
Yep.
So he started another women's group called DOS.
DOS, Dominus Obsequious Sororium.
And this was basically a group it was a master-slave style group.
Yeah, I was going to say, according to them, that means master over slave women.
Right. So he was getting more and more into this whole, I forget even the name of that fetish, but, locking people up and whips and chains and all that crazy stuff.
Yep.
And he actually built a dungeon, a sex dungeon to lock women up, and probably used it. We're not 100% sure. He definitely slept with some of these women.
Yeah.
He had them branded, but he had it framed to them that he wasn't doing this for Keith. Even the women that slept with him were ordered to by someone else, by another woman in the group.
Right.
That it would be good for them or good for Keith, but it wasn't in service to him. It was in service to the other woman. And this whole thing of freedom through submission.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've heard people preach this too before about freedom through submission.
Right.
And again, it's one of those slippery slopes. Because submission at a certain point,
Yep.
you know? And that's exactly what happened. The whole point was, this is going to be empowering and you're going to learn to be a better person. But he had to start with the original women's group, Jeunesse, and teach them that they were a flawed person.
Yep.
That their mind didn't work right and they couldn't make the right decisions. And that they had to be trained to make better decisions in order for DOS to succeed. Right. And this is what eventually was the downfall of his whole group. Honestly, he'd been going for many years.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, if he hadn't gone this far, he probably still would be going around.
He had multiple businesses and a harem of women for many years, so that really wasn't a big deal. And honestly, it's not against the law to go out and just sleep with many women.
Right.
Okay? It's against the law to marry them, but it's not against the law just to sleep with them. But where he went this was this whole master-slave thing. He was enslaving women. He literally branded them and made that part of that. And this is what we're talking about, social issues versus teachings here.
Right.
But his whole goal of that was to get him more and more women.
More women. Because if you were inducted into DOS, right, I don't know if you remember this, you were required to be available to your master, so whoever it was that inducted you, right, at the drop of a hat, right, for whatever they needed.
Even if you were asleep, they'd text you and you had to respond within 1 minute.
Within a minute, right? But, right, your goal was to get 6 women inducted that were under you that would do your work for you.
Yes, and they had to do at least an hour a week of work for you. And you did an hour a week of work for your master.
He was
building a multi-level marketing scam, a pyramid scheme.
Pyramid scheme of sex work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Absolutely.
However, part of the women he recruited to make money in NXIVM was actually these strong, independent women. Yes, they got fooled with this scam, but what his undoing was that he recruited strong, independent women. So a woman like Sarah Edmondson, I think she credited a lot of success to NXIVM and Raniere, but I think she would have been successful anyway because she just had that drive, and she's successful now getting out of the thing. She's a successful actress. She's successful doing podcasting and these books and all this stuff, she fell for it at first. And then when she realized what was going on, when she realized that the brand was Keith's initials, everything just clicked. I talked about Mark, and he was talking about the same sort of thing. He's a very strong, successful person. And same thing. Once it clicked, he said it was like he turned completely upside down. And then they worked together to tear this thing down.
Tear it down. Yep.
They couldn't get the media to pay attention. Many other people, there was the NXIVM 9 we talked about last episode, had tried, and they couldn't get anything done. And there was some illegal stuff happening, but you couldn't prove a lot of things.
Right.
However, when you're making people slaves and you're branding people and locking them in cages, that gets easier to prove.
It's a whole lot easier to prove. Yep. Well, Matt, so let's talk about proving some of those things in the social issues episode. How's that sound?
All right, y'all. I guess that's enough for teachings today. We'll follow up next episode about social issues.
We'll see you then.